Hello, and welcome back to BS with S.A.C, which, in case you have somehow forgotten, stands for Bedtime Stories with Sean Arthur Cox. My, what a wonderful coincidence those initials turned out to be. When last we left off, we were about halfway through Chapter 10, and William and Bloody John were in a rowboat, about to take on some very dark rapids, some very dangerous rapids, in the middle of a cave in a nearly pitch black environment, and it's all very dangerous and they're very scared. And William has a plan, and we're going to see how well that gets them through the rapids. William tried relaxing, watching the flora and fauna pass by as he drifted downriver, but as the water gained speed, he became more and more anxious. Nor was his anxiety helped by the fact that they were now close enough to the gate to hear the echo of raging currents like a ghostly howl rising up from the mouth of the mountain, reminding him that he was on the fast track for its throat. His hands shook in horrific anticipation. Perhaps it would be more calming instead to watch Bloody John work. Inside the bag, the pirate toiled with the sleeping bags. He'd taken scraps from the table that had been shoved inside earlier, and rings from a broken barrel, and created a skeletal frame to prop up the bags from the inside, allowing them to fill with air. Clever. Once he had adequately expanded the bags, Bloody John tore his shirt into strips and tied off the ends. Seeing the pirate's shirt shredded to save their lives, William smiled. At least he wasn't the only unchosen person on this crew. Bloody John secured the bags to the end of the rope, and William hoisted them up. After sliding them free from the bag one by one, William reached out past the gunwales, trying to place the makeshift pontoons at the ends of the crossbar. The boat rocked violently as he stretched his hands out, too far to reach. The rowboat raced toward the cavern ahead and the sixth gate that lay beyond in its dark depths. William's fingers flew, scrambling to untie the swollen knots that held the lattice fast. Without warning, the ship rammed a submerged log, and the boat began to veer wildly. The sudden shift in motion sent William lurching against the starboard gunwale, knocking the wind out of him. For a moment, he forgot about the knots, his attention consumed completely by the need to breathe. By the time he recovered, filling his lungs with deep, gasping breaths, the boat was the length of a field at most from the entrance. When he finally freed the lattice, he tugged at the sleeping bag at the bow, fastened it as tightly as he could, giving the circumstances, and heaved it and its supports over the port gunwales, shoving the pontoon outward to give him access to the other side. The light around him faded as the ship slipped into the mountain's gaping black maw, and William consigned himself to working in utter darkness. His hands dragged across the deck, seeking scraps with which to bind the second pontoon. Already he could feel the boat totter on the quickening waves. He took a cleansing breath, cleared all thoughts from his mind, and let the memory of motion guide his fingers where vision failed him. When he felt certain that the sleeping bag was firmly in place, he straightened the lattice and began to secure it. He only got one part fastened before the sleeping bag caught the waves and jerked hard, sending the craft spiraling out of control. The loose web of branches spun backward sharply, catching William in the chest. The boat slid wildly beneath the wooden grid, nearly knocking the boy into the water. He turned sideways, bracing his back against the port gunwale, and holding the defensive frame in place on the end of with his knee. "John," he shouted over the roar of the river, "I need you out here now!" The boat rocked furiously as Bloody John clambered out of the hole, throwing the ship's balance off kilter. The pirate's arms shot to both sides out of instinct, gripping blindly at the oars rather than the boat's frame. The wooden grill made moves to shift again under John's weight, but William braced hard and screamed, "We need to get this thing secure! Tie the pontoon frame to the oarlocks!" The pirate inched forward, trying desperately not to tip the boat, but a sudden impact to the left sent the man tumbling and the boat with him. William reacted in an instant and threw his body hard in the opposite direction to balance the small craft. "Back to the center! Now! Slowly!" Both eased their ways back firmly toward the middle, restoring their brief hold on balance. Bloody John eased toward the oarlocks again, this time reaching them with a relative degree of safety. An expert sailor, the pirate lashed the pontoon supports to the boat with ease. Despite the unsteady deck, the cold wet spray, the total darkness, and the maddening spin. With the framework in place, the rowboat's spiral eased and the course straightened. With the wind at their back and the distant speck of gray in the obsidian void directly in front of them, William knew they were facing the wrong way. Still, backward was better than out of control. "Now, swords in the water! We need to rudder ourselves around hard to starboard," William called. He felt like a captain already. They plunged their blades into the murky drink, but little happened. "Begging your pardon, Captain, but starboard's on the right," Bloody John corrected. William shifted his scimitar to the opposite side of the boat, and the boat rotated slowly at first, but whipped straight once they got past the 90-degree mark. He could faintly see in the distance, and Light grew hopeful. "Look, John! Light! We're through!" "Not hardly, Captain. Those are guide lights to let you know when a big turn is coming," John said. "And from the looks of it, we're almost on one now." "What does that mean exactly?" William asked, nervous. "Means unless you got a reliable way to steer, things are about to get real wobbly again." "That's what I was afraid of," he replied to John, but he'd spoken too late. The pirate had already returned to the bag. "Coward!" William thrust his scimitar in the water, hoping its broad blade could serve as a crude rudimentary rudder. Though he had very little success, he continued anyway, because a little success was better than none at all. He was able to make gradual lefts and eventual rights, and after the frequent impacts which spun the ship willy-nilly, he was usually able to straighten himself out before the next impact. He also had the advantage of being in a smaller craft. According to all rumors and campfire tales he'd heard about river gates, navigating them in the mightiest of ships was a danger unto itself. It only stood to reason that a smaller ship would fare worse. After all, no one crossed great oceans in a rowboat. It would be tantamount to suicide. Bigger, at least, for seafaring vessels, was better. Such was not the case in the gate. The river's terrifying teeth, the rocks jutting up from the riverbed, would tear a larger ship to pieces if it wasn't careful. A smaller ship, however, could for the most part pass between them with ease. Likewise, the dreaded shallows would ravage the keel of a deep-bottomed vessel. But for a low-draft vessel such as William's rowboat, navigation proved far more manageable. The rush of the waters proved the greatest challenge, and his defensive poles negated the worst of the impacts. "This isn't so bad," he said, leaning back as much as the lattice allowed him. Another hit, and the boat spun widdershins. A second impact against a large stone protruding up from the waves straightened the ship out again, but William could hear a crack in the left. The supports to the port pontoon bent slightly. Surveying the damage, William thanked his lucky stars for the original hit, which caused an impact to the back of the supports, splintering them toward the bow. As long as he kept the ship facing forward, the pressure of the waters against the pontoon would keep the supports in place. William kept the scimitar in the river with hopes of keeping any blows to the port side to a minimum. For a while, his plan worked. The torches gave him warning enough that even the meager efforts of his blade allowed him to turn in time, and as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed a very subtle blue glow to the river, probably moss spores tossed by the current, that let him fake maneuvering even when there were no torches about. "We just might make it after all," he thought. After several minutes without incident, William grew complacent, almost confident in his navigational prowess, which is why he failed to notice the sleeping bag pontoon on the starboard side had lost its air. The boy attributed the way the port side rose out of the river to his ability to carve a hard turn to the right. It wasn't until the frigid waters sloshed over the starboard gunwales that he thought to check other, more likely explanations. The boat had begun to take on water, and it wasn't long before complaints could be heard from the bottom of the bag. "Curse the seas!" shouted John in misery. "It's colder than your father's glare after he caught me with your mother." "Sorry, Bloody John," William called down. "Port side rigging's gotten pretty smashed, and the starboard pontoon's deflated." "Maybe if you knew how to work a sodden boat," John complained. "Maybe if the only experienced sailor on the ship weren't cowering in a hole like a landlubber." "Well, it's not my fault you never learned to row. And it's not my fault we're losing air on the right side. I imagine something like that would be due to a poor knot, don't you think?" They probably would have kept arguing had another wave not sloshed over the side, dumping more of the bone-chilling liquid into the boat, draining down into the bag. Both men screamed like small children at the shock of it. "So what do we do now, John?" William asked, barely containing a panic as the ship slowly filled. "You're the bloody captain. You tell me." So much for delegation. The boat had taken on a tendency to veer right, ever since the right pontoon began to lose air. Without the buoyancy to keep it resting lightly atop the waves, it had begun to drag hard against the waters, slowing the craft down unevenly, resulting in a gradual clockwise spin, which dipped the boat lower on one side, allowing the waves to splash over the sides. He couldn't simply remove the right pontoon altogether because it unbalanced the craft, increasing the likelihood of tipping the ship. He would have to remove both or deflate the port side. Removing both would even the weight and take some of the pressure off the defensive supports. It might well even make them more effective against impacts, as they wouldn't have the weight of the pontoons to contend with. On the downside, the boat would lose a good deal of its stability. Deflating both sides could also put extra weight on the protective rigging if the sleeping bags somehow filled with water. On the pro side, having the bags in the water did provide some drag, which slowed down the craft at least a little, again reducing the severity of any impacts. The torch flared in William's mind. He swung his scimitar hard at the knots, tying the pontoons to the rigging, starting with the left. Then, catching the bag on the hook of his blade, he pulled them in toward the center and plopped them down before him. Lining his sword carefully along the seam, he sliced through the stitches that bound the sturdy cloth to itself and lowered them into the bottomless bag. "What'd you do to my handiwork?" Bloody John cried. "It wasn't working," William replied, "but I've got an idea that might just save our skins." "And what's that?" the pirate asked. William untied the rope from the shoulder straps of the bottomless bag and let it drop in. "How am I supposed to get out?" John asked, indignant. "Worry about that later," William said. "For now, I need you to cut that rope into 4 pieces, 2 per bag. Tie one end of each rope to a corner on the cloth, opposite end to opposite end." "What's the plan?" Bloody John asked. Are you making a sail? To my understanding, sails speed you up. We're slowing down." John scratched his head in confusion, but did as he was told. When he finished, William leaned in as far as he could, while John held the cloth aloft on the tip of his blade. Both stretched to their limits, but couldn't quite reach. William cursed fortune to give him a potentially brilliant plan, only to be done in by his diminutive stature. "No good," shouted Bloody John. "You'll never reach." In response, William bent backward over the rigging, hooking his legs on its bars, and lowered himself into the bottomless bag. Pain took hold of his left ankle, but he put it out of his mind. He would have a lot more pain to deal with if he didn't slow the boat. His fingers met with cloth and rope. Then, curling his abs as hard as he could, he pulled himself forward and out, remnants of sleeping bags in hand. Sitting up, he strapped the bag to his back and tied his own body to the rigging. His plan would either succeed spectacularly or destroy the ship and drag him down with it, flailing and screaming. "All right, John," he said as he unfolded the cloth on his lap. "I need you to slide your arms through the rope so that they cross your chest. 2 X's, got it?" "Aye," Bloody John said, "but I don't understand what for." "You don't have to understand," William said, a mad smile adorning his face. "You just have to spread your limbs as wide as you can and jump when I count to 3. I suppose I can do that, but why?" "You'll see. 1, William checked the rope for any tangles and removed them. 2, he laid the cloth flat across his lap, spread as wide as he could make it. 3, William threw the cloth as high into the air as he could manage. John leapt and found himself yanked almost out of the bag, pulled upward by the sleeping bags as they caught air and began to soar away like a kite. Had he not remembered to spread his limbs wide, he'd have slipped clean through the bag's opening, and the crew of Captain William's maiden voyage would have been reduced by half. "Now I need you to hold on as long as you can," William said calmly. "To what?" John screamed in panic, clearly more at home in the water than in the air. "It's trying to kill me." "Relax, John," William said, then interjected quickly. "Or rather, don't relax. Hold that position steady for another minute more." "I don't know if I can," John cried. William could hear the tears. "Sure you can," he said, as he began to knot together the cloth strips that had once held the pontoons turned parachutes in place. "Just a little bit longer." William turned around, seizing John by the belt and tying the clothing rope around it firmly. Then he secured the other end to the straps of the bag. "Now, let go." "I can't," Bloody John wept. "Well, which is it?" William asked impatiently. "Earlier you said you couldn't hold on." "Okay, I can't choose to let go." "Then wear yourself out straining against the bag until your whole body gives out in exhaustion. The point is, you're—" William lurched back, tugged by the sudden appearance of an airborne pirate strapped to his back. The bag dug into his shoulders, but there was a noticeable drop in speed. All he had to do was keep the craft straight, and they were, presumably, home free. "Am I dead?" came a terrified voice behind him. William turned to see the terrified pirate suspended in mid-air. His white knuckles clung to the rope at his belt, as though to let go might end the world, which, from Bloody John's perspective, was probably true. Even so, for all the fear, for all the cursing, there he was, in the air without wings, a man at one with the birds. William clapped and shouted a triumphant call that echoed from all sides like an excited roar of an appreciative crowd. "No, John," William replied with a smile. "You're flying." John opened his eyes, narrow slits at first, then wider, taking in the wondrous sight before his eyes. He couldn't make out much. The light of scattered torches passing him was too dim, but he could see enough to note the river, which none too long ago had threatened to consume him whole, lay several feet below him, and he had risen above it. He laughed madly, his hysterical cackle echoing through the darkness of the 6th gate, loud enough to make men of lesser courage fear cave-ins. He spread his arms wide like the wings of a bird and leaned to the left and right, steering himself through the much friendlier skies. William watched the pirate's joyous romp through the air. An insufferable grin pulled at his cheeks, almost painfully. It was absolutely incredible. An air pirate, William laughed to himself. Now I've seen everything. The pirate's eyes widened more as he shoved a fist forward, fingers pointing straight ahead. Look! William turned in fear, expecting the worst. In the distance he saw a pinprick of blue-gold light. For a moment he couldn't tell what it was, and tried his best to paddle away from it. Then he smiled. Then he laughed. Then he whooped and cheered and let his fear dissipate as his cries of utter bliss echoed from the roof of the world. In the distance he could see dawn approaching. And that's where we'll stop. We'll see what's on the other side of the sixth gate when we pick up next time. Until then, I hope you enjoyed your story. Have good dreams.